In the 43rd year of the Galactic Research Consortium's existence, a senior xenobiology team submitted a study that was classified within 6 hours of its filing, reviewed by exactly 9 individuals across 4 separate administrative bodies, and then sealed under a designation that had only been used 11 times in the consortium's 4-decade history. The designation was not top secret. The consortium had hundreds of top secret files. The designation was something older than top secret, older than any formal classification framework the consortium had developed. It was a single word in the original Vaethian administrative language, a word that translated most accurately into Galactic Standard as "Do not continue." The study was titled Behavioral Patterns of Homo sapiens During Periods of Reduced Light, a Preliminary Observational Analysis. The lead researcher was a Vaethian xenobiologist named Thrensalos Kiv, who had spent 22 years studying carbon-based life forms across the Orion Arm and who had, by every account of his colleagues and supervisors, the specific professional disposition of a scientist who did not become alarmed easily. He had studied 6 apex predator species. He had done field observation on 2 worlds with active geological instability. He had once spent 14 months on a research station inside the atmosphere of a gas giant and filed his reports on time throughout. His colleagues said that Thrensalos Kiv was the least alarmable person any of them had ever worked with. His final report on the human study opened with a line that none of his colleagues in 22 years had ever seen him write. The line said, "I am recommending immediate classification of all findings contained herein, not because the data is dangerous, but because I believe the data is not yet fully understood, and data that is not yet fully understood about this particular species should not be in general circulation until we know more." The second paragraph said, "I am also recommending that future research teams assigned to human behavioral studies be substantially larger, substantially better equipped, and substantially more carefully briefed than my team was." The third paragraph said, "I am making this recommendation not from a position of alarm." Then there was a pause in the document that the formatting software rendered as a line break, but that everyone who read it interpreted as something else. Then it said, "I am making it from a position of deep professional respect for a species that made me most experienced researcher cry on day 11 of a 40-day observation window, and not from fear, and not from anything I have a clean word for, but from something that I think anyone who has spent significant time studying humans comes to eventually." The document did not complete that sentence. The 9 individuals who reviewed the classification recommendation read that incomplete sentence and, without coordinating with each other, all made the same decision. They classified the report permanently. The study had begun 3 years earlier, with considerably less drama. The Galactic Research Consortium had been conducting xenobiology studies of Earth since the species achieved first contact with the broader galactic community. This was standard practice. Every new civilization that entered the galactic framework received a full biological and behavioral workup from the consortium's research division, both for the scientific record and for the more practical purpose of giving other species enough information to interact with the new civilization without accidentally causing incidents. The human workup had been ongoing for 7 years by the time Thrensalos Kiv's team was assigned to it. 7 years of data had produced a file that the consortium's xenobiology division head, a methodical Karathi administrator named Velru Athos, described in a later interview as the most internally contradictory species profile in the division's history. Not because the data was unreliable. The data was meticulously collected. The contradiction was in the species itself. The standard behavioral profile for a newly contacted civilization followed a predictable architecture. There was the public behavior layer, which was what the species displayed when they knew they were being observed. There was the social behavior layer, which was what they displayed in group contexts with members of their own kind. There was the private behavior layer, which required more careful observation to document, and which typically showed the largest variance from the public layer. Human data had 4 layers instead of 3. The 4th layer had no standard nomenclature in the consortium's classification system. Velru Athos had given it a working label in his internal notes, a label that the records team would later flag as informal and not suitable for official documentation. The label was what they do when no one is watching. Most species in the consortium's extensive observational record showed relatively little behavioral variance between their private layer and the layer beneath it. The self-monitoring behaviors that produce the difference between social performance and genuine private action tended to remain constant even in full solitude, because most species' self-monitoring apparatus was not primarily driven by external observation. They behaved more or less the same whether observed or not. Humans were different in a way that the 7 years of existing data had documented but not adequately explained. When humans believed they were alone, in the dark, unobserved by any member of their species or any other, they did things that did not appear in any of the first 3 behavioral layers. Kiv's team had been assigned specifically to study that 4th layer. The team was 7 researchers, 5 Vithian, 1 Karathi, and 1 member of a species called the Maren, whose particular perceptual apparatus made them valuable in low-light observational contexts because they could see in ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum that most observation equipment could not match. Their research platform was a cloaked monitoring station positioned in low Earth orbit with surface-level sensor arrays so sensitive that they could, under optimal conditions, detect the electrochemical activity of a sleeping human brain from 40 kilometers above ground level. They had been briefed on the existing human data before deployment. They had read the 7 years of files. They had attended 4 briefing sessions with the researchers who had compiled those files, 2 of whom had retired from active field work and 1 of whom had taken an extended leave of absence that was technically voluntary. Kiev had noted, at the time, that one researcher taking a voluntary leave of absence after a human behavioral study was a statistical anomaly but not alarming. He had been a xenobiologist for 22 years. He was not easy to alarm. Day 1 of the observation window was unremarkable. The sensor arrays were calibrated. The data recording systems were initialized. The team established baseline readings for electromagnetic activity, thermal signatures, chemical emissions, and acoustic output in their assigned observation zones across 3 different geographic regions of Earth. Day 3 produced the first data point that the team flagged for closer analysis. It was night in one of the observation zones. The human population in the monitored area had, as the existing behavioral data predicted, reduced their social activity substantially. The noise levels fell. The movement patterns simplified. The electromagnetic signatures of their artificial lighting systems began to extinguish in sequences that the data identified as the species preparing for the sleep cycle. And then, in the darkness that followed, the sensor arrays began detecting things that were not in the behavioral profile. The first thing the sensors found was sound. Not loud sound, the opposite of loud sound. The consortium's acoustic sensors were calibrated for the frequency ranges that most sapient species used for communication, which tended to cluster in the mid-range of whatever atmospheric medium the species operated in. Human vocalizations in the public and social layers fell neatly within those parameters. The sounds that the sensors picked up in the dark were different. Some were at the low end of human vocal range. Sounds that the acoustic analysis software categorized as non-linguistic vocalizations, which was the technical way of saying sounds that humans made that were not words and did not appear to be intended for communication with other humans. Some were higher, a quality that the software's emotional mapping module, trained on 7 years of human data, identified as carrying high emotional load, but could not classify further, because the classification matrix did not have a category for the combination of frequencies it was detecting. Researcher Shenvalos Ort, the team's acoustic specialist, spent the first 3 days assuming the anomalous sounds were a calibration artifact. On day 4, she ran a full recalibration and confirmed they were not. She filed a note in the team's shared research log that said, "The sounds humans make in the dark are categorically different from any sounds they make when observed. I am tagging this for follow-up, but I do not yet have a framework for interpreting it." The second thing the sensors found was movement. Humans in the dark moved differently than humans in the light, not more carefully, which would have been consistent with a species navigating in reduced visual conditions, differently in ways that were not primarily practical. They moved more slowly in some contexts, a slowness that the motion analysis software associated with deliberateness rather than caution. They moved more fluidly in others, with a quality of physical expression that was almost entirely absent from the movement patterns documented in the public and social layers. The Marin researcher whose name translated roughly as Clear Water Deep, was the first team member to articulate what was different about the movement. On day 6, Clearwater Deep filed a note that said, "They move in the dark like they are not performing. I do not know how else to describe it. In the light, there is always a quality to human movement that suggests awareness of being seen. In the dark, that quality is absent. What replaces it is something I find. I do not have existing terminology for the third thing the sensors found was more difficult to categorize the thermal and chemical sensor arrays, designed to document biological state data, began returning readings in the dark observation periods that initially appeared to indicate medical anomalies, elevated neurochemical activity that did not correspond to the physical activity levels being recorded, cardiovascular patterns that the medical analysis software classified as stress responses, but that did not correlate with any observable stressor, hormone profiles that the endocrinology module flagged as associated with extreme emotional states in individuals who appeared by every external measure to simply be sitting alone in the dark. Kiv reviewed those readings on day 7. He ran the data through the analysis software 3 times. Then he filed a note that said, "The biological data suggests that when humans are alone in the dark, they are having experiences that their bodies treat as significant by some of these chemical markers as combat, or grief, or profound joy. We cannot determine which because the external expression is minimal. They are sitting still. Their bodies are doing something else entirely." On day 9, the team began targeted observation of individual subjects. The standard research protocol for species. Behavioral study involved wide area observation supplemented by targeted observation of representative individuals, a sample selected to cover the demographic and geographic variance in the population. Kiv had 12 individuals selected for targeted observation based on the 7-year baseline data, 6 female, 6 male, representing 12 different geographic regions and 11 different cultural frameworks. He assigned 1 researcher to each individual. The plan was for each researcher to maintain continuous observation of their assigned subject through the sleep cycle and document the 4th layer behaviors in detail. What happened over the following 9 days produced the data that would eventually fill the classified report. Researcher Vel Morris-Ith was assigned to a human male, 43 years old, living alone in Asmal, dwelling in a northern, coastal region of the North American continent. The existing baseline data identified him as employed, socially active, in good health, unremarkable in every respect that the first 3 behavioral layers documented. On the first night of targeted observation, Vel Morrisith watched this human come home at the end of his day, prepare food, communicate with several other humans through the electronic network they maintained, and then, as the light from outside faded, sit down in a chair in a room he had not lit. He sat there for 4 hours. He did not sleep. The neurological readings confirmed wakefulness throughout. He did not communicate. The acoustic sensors detected no vocalizations for the first 2 hours. He did not engage with any of his technological devices. He simply sat in the dark in a room alone. And the sensor array documented his biological state shifting through a sequence of readings that Vel Morrisith filed at the end of the observation period with an annotation that said, "I am uncertain what to make of this. He appears to be processing something. The chemical markers suggest the processing is significant. I cannot determine the subject of the processing from external data. I am requesting guidance on how to interpret an observation, where the visible behavior is stillness and the biological signature is a storm." Thren Saloskiv did not have guidance to offer. He filed the note and continued the observation. On the second night, the human sat in the dark again. On the third night, he did not sit in the dark. He stood in front of a window for 3 hours looking at a sky that the sensor array confirmed was overcast and showing nothing visible through the cloud cover. He was looking at a sky that contained nothing to see. The biological readings during those 3 hours were the most intense of the observation period. So far, Vel Morrisith's Day 3 report ended with a sentence that the research team would later discuss at length. It said, "I have been studying life forms for 11 years and I have never observed a being that appeared to be holding a conversation with the inside of itself." Researcher Keth Alan Voss was assigned to a human female, 31 years old, living in a densely populated urban center in Western Europe. She was, by the baseline data, a musician. Not professionally, her primary occupation was administrative, but the behavioral record showed that she spent a significant portion of her working hours engaged in the creation of organized sound using a stringed instrument that the cultural database identified as a violin. The existing data documented this behavior in social contexts, in semi-public contexts, and in private contexts when she believed herself unobserved. On day 11 of the targeted observation, she came home late. The thermal sensors showed elevated fatigue markers. The chemical array detected stress, hormone profiles consistent with what the analysis software labeled as a difficult day. She did not eat. She sat on the floor of her living space, not on the furniture, on the floor, and she picked up the instrument and she played it in the dark for 2 hours. Kathleen Voss had studied music as a cultural artifact in her training. She had reviewed the consortium's cataloged recordings of music from hundreds of species. She had the professional detachment of a researcher who understood that aesthetic experiences were species-specific, and that emotional responses to another species' art were not analytically reliable. She watched this human play a stringed instrument, alone on the floor of a dark room, and she filed her observation report at the end of the night, and at the bottom of the report, in the notes field that was technically meant for methodological observations, she wrote 8 words. The 8 words were, "I did not expect to feel that." Thrensalis Kiev read the note. He did not flag it. He did not counsel his researcher on professional detachment. He had been watching the accumulated data from all 12 targeted subjects for 11 days, and he understood, with the specific clarity that comes from enough data, points aligning in the same direction, that the note was not a lapse in professional distance. It was a data point. Something was happening in the dark, something that his instruments could measure the edges of and could not measure the interior of, something that the humans themselves appeared to regard as necessary, given how consistently and how privately they engaged in it. He filed his own note in the research log that night. It said, "Hypothesis preliminary and unverified. The 4th behavioral layer of this species is not, as I initially theorized, simply the absence of social performance. It is something that functions as an internal maintenance system. They go into the dark not because the light has left, but because the dark is where they do something the light does not allow. I do not yet know what that something is, but the biological data suggest it is not passive. It is one of the most active things they do." On day 14, the research team had an internal review session. The session was scheduled as a routine data comparison meeting, the kind that teams conducting long-form observational research held periodically to ensure that individual observation streams were being interpreted through a consistent analytical framework. What it became, approximately 40 minutes in, was something else. It started with Clearwater Deep, presenting the movement data from the dark observation periods. The presentation was professional and methodical. Time-stamped clips from the sensor feeds, correlated with biological state data, annotated with the acoustic readings. It was a research presentation. It was supposed to produce analytical discussion. The first analytical discussion point came from the Korathi researcher, whose name translated as Still Mountain, who said that the movement patterns he was seeing in the data reminded him of something he did not have a professional term for, and that he would describe as a being expressing something that has no expression in language. Then Vel Morris Ith said that the subject he was observing had done something on day 12 that had not filed a formal report on because he could not determine what category to file it under. He said his subject had gone outside at 3 in the morning, in the dark, in cold weather, and had stood in an open field for 40 minutes. He said the biological readings during those 40 minutes were the most intense he had documented. He said his subject had been completely still, and the sensor array had been recording what appeared to be one of the most significant experiences of this individual's life, and he could not determine what was happening because the external expression was a human standing in a cold field in the middle of the night, looking at nothing. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kathleen Voss said, without preamble, that she had filed a note on day 11 that she wanted to amend. She said the note had said she did not expect to feel something. She wanted to clarify that what she had felt was not an aesthetic response. It was something she would describe as recognition. She said that watching the human play music in the dark had produced in her the specific sensation of watching a being engage in an activity that was not for any external audience whatsoever. She said it was the most private thing she had ever observed. She said she felt that she had seen something she was not supposed to see, not because it was hidden, but because it was simply not meant for any eye other than the one experiencing it. Then she said, "I do not know what they are doing in the dark, but I know it matters more to them than almost anything we have documented in the other 3 behavioral layers. And I think there is, and it is in a 4th layer that our framework did not previously account for, is because it is not a social behavior at all. It is not about other humans. It is something they are doing for themselves, by themselves, that has nothing to do with any external context, and that appears to be as necessary to their functioning as sleep. Thren Salos Kiv listened to all of this, then he said, "We are going to need more time." They extended the observation window by 21 days. In those 21 days, the team documented behaviors that expanded the classification problem, rather than resolving it. On day 16, researcher Shenvalo Sort documented a human male sitting in a dark room, with audio recordings playing from an electronic device. The recordings were classified in the cultural database as music. The subject listened to them for 3 hours. The biological readings showed the kind of neurological activity that the analysis software associated with deep memory processing. The specific patterns that appeared when a being was not simply receiving sensory input, but integrating it with existing experiential data in a way that altered the existing data. He was not simply listening to music. He was being changed by it, incrementally, in ways that would persist after the music stopped. On day 19, Clearwater Deep documented 3 humans in a small urban dwelling, who spent 4 hours in darkness together and did not sleep and barely spoke. The acoustic sensors picked up fragments of conversation, but the conversations were not the kind that the social behavior layer documented. They were shorter, slower, with long pauses between statements that the emotional mapping software identified as carrying more content than the statements themselves. The 3 humans appeared to be communicating in a register that was only available in the dark, and communicating things that would not have been communicated in any other context. On day 22, Still Mountain documented a human child, approximately 8 years old, who'd woken in the middle of the night, and instead of activating the artificial lighting or calling for an adult, had lain still in the dark for 2 hours. The biological readings showed that the child was not afraid. The neurological activity was consistent with something the pediatric development module labeled as deep integrative processing, the specific cognitive work that young organisms do when consolidating experiences into long-term, functional frameworks. The child was lying in the dark by itself, and its brain was doing the architectural work of the building itself, and it had chosen the dark to do it in. On day 25, Velmorasith's subject drove alone at night for 4 hours with no apparent destination. The route data showed him covering 400 kilometers of road before returning home. He played no audio during the drive. The biological readings showed a sustained neurochemical profile that the emotional analysis software flagged as indeterminate, a combination of markers that appeared in its training data in the context of grief and also in the context of resolution and also in the context of what one of the consortium's human behavioral consultants had once described in a notation that Thren Saloskiv had read in the existing data and that he now thought about differently, as working something out. Vel Morasith filed a report on the drive that included a passage that Thren Saloskiv read twice. The passage said, "I have now spent 25 days observing this individual in all behavioral contexts, in the light, in social context, in professional context, in private context with other humans. I have a reasonably complete picture of who he is by every standard metric we use. But the person I see in the light and the person the biological data describes in the dark are not contradictory. They are continuous. The dark is not where this human hides. The dark is where this human works. The light is the output. The dark is where the output is made." On day 30, Kethalon Vas submitted a request to extend the observation window further. Thren Saloskiv denied the extension, not because the research was not producing valuable data, because he had been watching his team for 30 days, and he had noticed something that he considered, as a responsible team leader, more immediately relevant than the data. He had noticed that his researchers were having trouble maintaining professional distance, not in any obvious way, not in a way that compromised their data collection or their analytical output, but in a way that he recognized as significant precisely because it was subtle. They were spending their off-rotation hours reviewing data. That was not their assignment. They were filing longer notes than the protocol required. They were using language in their formal reports that was technically accurate, but that carried a quality he would describe as care. Xenobiologists did not typically develop care for their subjects, not the clinical kind of care that involved concern for subject well-being, which was a standard ethical protocol. The other kind, the kind that made you extend observation windows because you did not want to stop watching, the kind that made you file an 8-word note about not expecting to feel something, and then amend it later because the original note was not accurate enough. On day 31, Thrensalos called a team meeting and told them he was ending the active observation phase and moving to data analysis. The meeting was quiet in a way that meetings were not usually quiet. Kethalon Voss asked, in a tone that was professionally neutral and personally not, whether they would be returning for a second observation window. Thrensalos said he did not know. He said that depended on the analysis phase. She said, I want to understand it. What they do in the dark. I want to understand what it is, he said. So do I. He said it in a tone that was not standard research team leader reassurance. He said it in the tone of someone who has watched 30 days of data accumulate and has arrived at the specific destination of someone who has been a scientist for 22 years and has found, for the first time, a question they are not sure their existing framework is adequate to answer. The data analysis phase lasted 4 months. They had 40 terabytes of sensor data from 31 days of continuous observation across 12 targeted subjects in 3 wide area observation zones covering a combined population of approximately 800,000 humans. They had the acoustic archive, the movement archive, the biological state archive, and the behavioral sequence archive. They had 642 formal observation reports and an additional 417 informal notes that Thrensalos had decided, after some deliberation, to include in the analytical corpus because he believed they contained data that the formal reports did not. The analysis software produced a preliminary classification report after 6 weeks. Thrensalos read the preliminary classification report and then called the lead programmer of the analysis software and told her that the software was producing non-answers and that he needed her to look at the classification matrix. The programmer, a Vethian named Orosvel Nim, who had designed the behavioral analysis system used by the consortium's xenobiology division, came back 4 days later and told him that the software was not malfunctioning. She said, the software is doing exactly what it is designed to do. It is comparing observed behaviors against the existing behavioral classification framework and returning confidence ratings for each classification match. The reason you are getting non-answers is that the behaviors in your data do not match any existing classification. Thrensalos said, that is what I was afraid of. Orosvel Nim looked at his data for a long time before she spoke again. She said, the closest matches in the entire classification library are in a category called ritual behavior, but the confidence rating on those matches is 23%, which is below our threshold for meaningful classification. Ritual behavior in the existing database is always social. It always involves other members of the species. It always has a defined external purpose. What your humans are doing in the dark is private, individual, and has no definable external purpose that the software can identify. She said, which means either the software's framework is wrong, or the external purpose does not exist, or the external purpose exists but is not external. Thrensalos said, explain the last option, she said. There is a theoretical classification category that the division proposed 12 years ago and never adopted because it did not apply to any observed species. The category was called internal purposive behavior. The working definition was behavior that an organism engages in for the primary purpose of altering or maintaining its own internal state, rather than for any social or environmental purpose. Behavior that is its own outcome, she said. Your data matches this category at 61% confidence, which is below our standard adoption threshold, but is substantially higher than anything else in the library. Thrensalos was quiet for a moment. He said, they are doing things in the dark that have no purpose except what happens inside them when they do it, Orosvel Nim said. That is what the data suggests, he said. And the reason no other species in our database does this is, she said, we have not previously observed a species with sufficient internal complexity to require it as a regular maintenance activity. The closest analog in the existing database is the sleep cycle in highly complex organisms, which also has no social purpose, and is done in the dark and is non-negotiable for the organism's functioning, she said. The difference is that sleep is involuntary. What your humans are doing is chosen. The team spent 6 weeks trying to understand what the humans were choosing to do and why they were choosing to do it in the dark specifically. The data produced several partial answers, none of which felt complete. The acoustic data suggested that the dark altered the humans' relationship to their own internal monologue. The analysis software had developed, over 7 years of existing research, a reasonably reliable model of human neurological activity correlated with vocalizations. In the dark, the relationship between neurological activity and vocalization changed in a way that suggested the internal monologue intensified while the external expression decreased. They were becoming louder to themselves while becoming quieter to the world. The movement data suggested that the dark removed a layer of self-monitoring that was present in all light contexts. Clearwater Deep had described this as the removal of performance. The analysis software quantified it as a reduction in the behavioral indicators associated with self-observation. In the light, humans were always watching themselves. In the dark, they stopped. The biological data suggested that the dark was associated with the processing of emotional content that was not processed during light periods. The endocrinological profiles were consistent with an organism releasing biochemical states that had accumulated during the day's social activity and had not been discharged through social expression. But none of these partial answers resolved the central question, which was the question that Ketha Lon Voss had articulated in her request for the extended observation window. The question was, what is it? Not the mechanism. They had reasonable models of the mechanism. The question was what the thing itself was. The thing the humans went into the dark to do. The thing that made a musician sit on the floor of an unlit room and play for 2 hours for an audience of no one. The thing that made a man drive 400 kilometers at night with the radio off and return home having done something the biological data recorded as significant, and the behavioral record could not name. The answer that Thrin Saloskiv arrived at, after 4 months of analysis and 6 weeks of failed attempts to find cleaner language for it, was in the final section of the classified report. It was 3 paragraphs long, and it was the section that the 9 reviewers all read multiple times before making their classification decision. The first paragraph said, "We believe that humans go into the dark to be themselves." It continued, "Not the version of themselves that exists in relation to others, not the version that is a professional, a family member, a member of a community, a representative of a culture, the prior version, the version that precedes all social context. Our data suggests that this version of the human organism exists in a state of continuous suppression during light period social activity, and that it requires regular, unsuppressed time in order to function. The dark is the condition under which unsuppression is possible, because the dark removes the external cues that activate the suppression mechanism." It concluded, "We do not know if other species have a prior version that exists beneath their social functioning. Our research framework has not previously looked for one. We may have been looking at species the way you look at architecture and missing what is inside the walls." The second paragraph said, "We believe that what humans do in the dark is not separable from what makes them what they are in the light." It continued, "The behaviors documented in this study were initially framed as a distinct fourth behavioral layer, beneath and separate from the social layers above it. We no longer believe this framing is accurate. The data suggests that the fourth layer is not below the other 3. It is the foundation of them. What a human does alone in the dark at 3 in the morning shapes what the human is in every other context. The dark work produces the light output. Without the dark work, the light output becomes, based on our longitudinal data on subjects we observed over multiple sleep cycles, thinner, more performed, less continuous with whatever the human actually is." It concluded, "We are describing a species whose depth of self exceeds what any external observation of their social behavior would suggest. We observed 12 humans for 31 days. The surface was not the being." The third paragraph said, "We are recommending classification of this report not because these findings are dangerous and not because they reveal capabilities that threaten other species." It continued, "We are recommending classification because we believe that the galactic research community is not currently equipped to study what this data describes, and that studying it without adequate equipment will produce conclusions that are wrong in ways that may be worse than having no conclusions at all. We have 47 years of behavioral data on species across the Orion Arm. That data was collected using frameworks designed to document what organisms do. It was not designed to document what organisms are. Those are different questions. We did not know they were different questions until we spent 30 days watching humans in the dark." It concluded, "We are also recommending, and we want to be clear that this recommendation is made in full professional seriousness by a team with a combined 80 years of xenobiology experience that any future research team assigned to study the human fourth behavioral layer be briefed on this finding. You will develop something for your subjects that our professional vocabulary does not have a clean word for. This is not a methodological failure. This is what happens when you look at a being long enough and carefully enough to see what it actually is rather than what it shows. We consider it a sign that you are doing the research correctly. The report ended there. The 9 reviewers classified it. Within 6 hours, Thrensalos Kiev returned to the consortium's primary research station after the classification review. He filed 2 follow-up recommendations. The first was for the establishment of a dedicated research division within the xenobiology department focused on internal state, behavioral analysis across all species in the contact database, using a revised framework that had been informed by the human study. The recommendation was accepted 6 months later. The second recommendation was more personal. He recommended that the consortium establish direct research collaboration with the human scientific community, specifically the Earth-based institutions studying human psychology and neurology and consciousness. He attached a note to the recommendation that said, "They have been studying this about themselves for centuries. They have names for what we observed. We should be learning from them rather than observing them from orbit." The second recommendation was accepted 8 months after that, and the collaboration it established would eventually become one of the most productive joint research programs in the consortium's history, producing findings that revised the behavioral taxonomy of 11 other species over the following 20 years. Keth Alon Voss did not return to observational fieldwork immediately. She spent 18 months in the consortium's theoretical division, working on the revised classification framework that Thrensalos Kiev's recommendation had established. The framework he helped design was adopted in the 3rd year of the collaboration with Earth institutions and was described by one of the human researchers, who reviewed it as the first external framework he had ever seen that understood the difference between a person and a person's behavior. She would eventually return to fieldwork, and she would eventually return to Earth, not as an observer this time. As a collaborator, the distinction mattered to her in a way she has been trying to articulate since day 11 of the original study, when she had sat in the dark of the monitoring station and listened to a human play a violin for an audience of no one and had written 8 words in a note field that was not meant for that kind of writing. She articulated it. Finally, in a paper she co-authored with 3 human researchers in the 14th year of the collaboration. The paper was about the specific mechanisms by which different species processed internal emotional content and the different roles that solitude and darkness played in those mechanisms across species. It was a technical paper. It was thorough and methodically structured and backed by extensive data. The acknowledgments section was not technical. In the acknowledgments section, she wrote, "This research began when a small team watched humans in the dark for 30 days and came away understanding that we had been studying beings for decades, the way you study weather systems, and that the question we should have been asking was not, what do these organisms do, but what are they? We are grateful to our human collaborators for the patience with which they have been answering that question for centuries, and for the generosity with which they shared their answers with researchers who arrived at the question late. The classified report stayed classified, not because of danger, not because the findings revealed capabilities that other species needed to be protected from. It stayed classified for the reason Thrensalos Kiev had originally given. The data was not yet fully understood. In the 20 years following the original study, the consortium's revised xenobiology framework documented internal purposive behavior, the category Orosvel Nim had identified in 4 other species. In all 4 cases, the behaviors were less intense and less varied than the human versions. In all 4 cases, the discovery produced significant revisions to those species' behavioral profiles and, in 2 cases, to the consortium's entire understanding of those civilizations. The human version remained, as of the last update to the theoretical division's comparative database, the most complex and the least fully characterized. The designation at the top of the original report, "Do not continue," had been given a secondary notation when the classification was renewed in the 5th year. The secondary notation was not a standard classification language. It was written by the reviewing administrator, a Karathi named Vel Ru Athos, who had spent 30 years in the xenobiology division and who had read the 3 paragraphs with the attention of someone who understood what they meant. The secondary notation said, continue carefully with better tools than we currently have, and with the specific understanding that what we are studying is not a behavioral phenomenon. It is a species with an interior, and we are only at the door. The collaborative research program that grew from Thrensalos Kiv's second recommendation was called, officially, the Joint Consciousness Studies Initiative. The humans called it the Dark Project, not because anyone had told them about the classified report, because the research area had opened up. The study of internal experience as distinct from observable behavior felt to the human researchers involved like work that had been waiting in the dark for a long time. Dr. Amara Osei, the first human co-director of the program, described it in a lecture she gave in the program's 7th year as the moment when the galaxy knocked on the door of a room we had been alone in for a very long time and asked if they could come in. She said it felt like the most important door anyone had ever opened. She said she hoped they were ready for what waits in both sides of it. In the program's 11th year, one of the joint research teams, 3 Vathian researchers and 2 humans, published a finding that revised the classification of internal, purposive behavior in a way that produced significant discussion in the scientific community and that the popular press in multiple Earth languages described, in various ways, as the discovery that humans were not unusual in having an interior life but were unusual in the degree to which that interior life was developed, exercised, and central to their functioning. The specific finding was this. In the 23 species for which the consortium now had comprehensive behavioral data under the revised framework, the ratio of social behavioral complexity to internal behavioral complexity varied significantly. In most species, the ratio was weighted toward the social layer because social behavior was observable and had therefore been developed, studied, and refined over millennia in response to social feedback. Internal behavior was not subject to social feedback. It developed in response to the organism's own requirements alone. In 22 of the 23 species studied, this produced an internal behavioral layer that was simpler than the social layer. In one species, the reverse was true. The internal behavioral complexity of humans exceeded their social behavioral complexity by a factor that the paper, being a scientific paper, expressed as a ratio. But one of the human researchers on the team, in an email to her co-director after the paper was accepted for publication, multiple Earth languages described in various ways as the discovery that humans were not unusual in having an interior life but were unusual in the degree to which that interior life was developed, exercised, and central to their functioning. The specific finding was this. In the 23 species for which the consortium now had comprehensive behavioral data under the revised framework, the ratio of social behavioral complexity to internal behavioral complexity varied significantly. In most species, the ratio was weighted toward the social layer because social behavior was observable and had therefore been developed, studied, and refined over millennia in response to social feedback. Internal behavior was not subject to social feedback. It developed in response to the organism's own requirements alone. In 22 of the 23 species studied, this produced an internal behavioral layer that was simpler than the social layer. In one species, the reverse was true. The internal behavioral complexity of humans exceeded their social behavioral complexity by a factor that the paper, being a scientific paper, expressed as a ratio. But one of the human researchers on the team, in an email to her co-director after the paper was accepted for publication, described it in different language. She said, "What the data shows is that the person a human is in public is the simplified version. The full version is what they are alone in the dark. We have been showing the galaxy our drafts this whole time. The actual work is what we do when no one is watching." Thrensalos Kiv retired from active research in the 18th year of the collaboration. He had spent 22 years before the human study doing xenobiology, and he spent the 18 years after it doing xenobiology differently, with a framework that asked different questions and that he described, in his retirement address to the consortium's annual conference, as the framework of a researcher who has finally understood that the most interesting things in the data are the ones that do not fit the existing categories. He said, "I spent 30 days watching humans in the dark, and I did not understand what I was watching. I spent the next 18 years trying to understand it. I'm not sure I understand it fully yet. I think that is appropriate. I think a species whose depth exceeds your current instruments is the kind of species you spend a career on," he said. "What I know is that the report we filed at the end of those 30 days was a door We walked through it, and the room on the other side was larger than we expected. We have been exploring it ever since. We have found things in it that have revised what we thought we knew about consciousness and about what it means to be a being who has an inside as well as an outside. We have found things that have no names in our language and that the humans have been naming for centuries, and that we are still learning to pronounce correctly, he said. We classified the original report because we did not understand it yet. I believe that was the right decision. Some things should not be in general circulation before they are understood, but I want to say clearly, as someone who filed that recommendation, that the classification wasn't fear. It was not alarm. It was the specific response of a scientist who has found data that exceeds his current framework and who has the intellectual honesty to say so rather than forcing inadequate language onto something that deserves better. He paused. He said, "What humans do in the dark is not a mystery to be solved. It is a depth to be respected. It is what they are when they are most themselves. And I believe that understanding it, really understanding it, is one of the most important things this research community has ever attempted," he said. I am grateful that we tried. In the 47th year of the Galactic Research Consortium's existence, someone filed a petition to declassify the original report. The petition came from the Earth scientific community. Specifically, it came from Dr. Amara Osei, who by that point had been co-director of the Joint Consciousness Studies Initiative for 15 years and who had, in those 15 years, read more of the classified report's findings through their downstream effects on the collaborative research than most people who had read the original document. The petition said, "We believe the research community and the human community both would benefit from access to the original findings, not because the findings are flattering to humanity, or because we want a public record of what you thought of us in those 30 days, but because the questions the report raised are the same questions we have been asking about ourselves for all of recorded history, and it seems right that a document that asks them from the outside should be available alongside the documents we have produced asking them from the inside." The petition said, "We are not afraid of what it contains. We have been sitting in the dark with ourselves for a very long time. We know what is in there." The consortium's classification review board considered the petition for 3 months. They denied it. The denial notation written by the current board chair, a Vathian named Thros Kelaum, who had been in the xenobiology division for 12 years and who had read the original report twice before writing the notation, said, "We are not denying this petition because the data is dangerous. We are denying it because the report contains a description of humanity that we believe the galactic research community is still not fully equipped to receive. We continue to work toward being equipped. We expect to revisit this determination." Below the formal notation, in handwriting that was technically not part of the official record, she had added 3 words. The 3 words were, "They are right." Keth Allen Voss was 61 years old when the petition was denied. She was living on Earth by then, had been for 6 years. She had a small dwelling in the same coastal city where her original research subject had lived, the musician she had watched play violin on the floor of a dark room for 2 hours on day 11 of a study. She had not expected to change her life. She had met the musician. That had happened in the 3rd year of the collaboration, when the Joint Consciousness Studies Initiative had, with appropriate ethical protocols and the musician's fully informed consent, invited some of the original observation subjects to participate directly in the research. The musician's name was Clara. She was 43 years old by then. She was still not professionally a musician. She still played in the dark. They had become what Clara, in the direct way that humans named things, called friends. What Kethalon Voss called it was more complex, and she had spent 6 years living on Earth learning Tobe comfortable with the English word, which she had come to believe was one of the most precisely inadequate and simultaneously most accurate words in any language she had encountered. On the evening that the declassification denial came through, Kethalon Voss sat in her small dwelling, in the dark for a long time. She had been doing this since the 3rd year of the collaboration, when a human researcher had looked at her biometric data from a session run without her awareness and had told her, with the specific gentle directness that this particular human used when telling people things they needed to hear, that her physiological responses during unlit rest periods were consistent with the internal purposive behavior profile. The researcher had said, "You were always doing it. We just did not have a framework for what you were doing until you helped us build one." Kethalon Voss had been quiet for a long time after that. Then she had said, "I learned it from them. from watching them in the dark for 30 days. I watched them do it and something in me recognized it and started doing it. 2. The researcher had said, yes, that is what we call teaching now. She sat in the dark and she thought about the original report and the 3 paragraphs and the 9 reviewers and the do not continue designation, and the 18 years of collaboration that had followed. She thought about Thrin Salos-Kiev's retirement speech. She thought about Clara on the floor with the violin. She thought about a man driving 400 kilometers at night for reasons that no external sensor array could fully document. She thought about what the petition had said. We know what is in there. The darkness was complete. The city outside was quiet. The sensor arrays that had once watched humans in moments like this were not here. There was no data being collected. There was no report being written. She was alone in the dark. She stayed there for 3 hours and no one saw, and it was enough.